that the economy, having gone down, will stay down for a very long time. It's in that context that I want to talk about the first of my China-related issues. And that issue is the issue of China's trade surplus and its foreign exchange policy. What we saw in the build-up to this crisis was a very extraordinary period of international imbalances. It's actually so extraordinary it's making me thirsty, so let me grab a bottle of water and I'll be back. Okay. So, what can we say? The picture that you want to look at is probably this one. This shows current account imbalances in 4 major regions of the world. One of them, the purple lines pointing down, showing negative, is, of course, the United States, which became a very large deficit country in the course of the run-up to the crisis. Offsetting, matching the U.S. deficits were surpluses in 3 principal regions. One, NIEs, that's the newly industrialized economies. That means Asian countries that are already at advanced country levels of income. That means Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. They all began running substantial surpluses after the financial crisis of the late 1990s, largely as a precautionary measure, but they were fairly modest. The Middle East, that's obvious. That's the oil-rich countries. They were running large surpluses. Those have gone away, but I think they'll come back for reasons I'll explain in a little while. And the big part is developing Asia, which means Vietnam, means some of the other parts of Asia, but mostly it means you. Mostly it means China. China began running enormous surpluses, current account surpluses of 10% or more of GDP. These surpluses, at one level, you can say it's a story about China having very high saving, so that even though it had high investment, it saved even more than it invested. But they're also very much a byproduct of policy. And the exchange rate policy was to keep the renminbi pegged to the dollar, which from 2002 on actually meant a substantial depreciation against a broader basket of currencies, and to sustain that peg by buying up dollars as necessary, which meant accumulating very large foreign exchange reserves. In order to avoid having those purchases of dollars be inflationary, China's government had to sterilize. In effect, it had to borrow money in the Japanese market. Japanese. I'm having a mental block there. Chinese market. And what that meant, looked at more broadly, is that in effect, China's government was taking capital out of China and exporting it abroad. So the Chinese private sector was generating a large surplus. Private capital was actually flowing into China, but all of that was being recycled and exported abroad. And for quite a while, it was a comfortable arrangement for everybody. The United States got cheap money, which we could use to finance construction of houses and also high levels of consumption. China got a very large export market, was able to rely upon export-driven growth during this period. Very comfortable arrangement, a little strange if you thought about it. I wrote back in 2005 that the U.S. economy had become a place in which people made a living by selling each other houses which they paid for with money they borrowed from China. So it was not exactly a sustainable arrangement, but it was an arrangement that for a while seemed to work for everyone. It's not going to work looking forward. We're not going to return to the days of 2006, 2007, when all of this worked smoothly. The United States was on a great borrowing spree, not just looking at nationally, but especially if you look at households. This is a chart I find extremely striking. It shows U.S. household debt. So this does not include corporate borrowing. This is just families borrowing for houses, credit cards. Household debt as a percentage of GDP. We had a great increase in debt after World War II as people bought houses. But then we had a long period of stability. We seemed to do reasonably well with debt at about 50% of GDP. But after about 1980, financial deregulation, growing belief that there would be no severe recessions in the future, financial innovation, general belief that debt was okay, we saw an extraordinary rise, a doubling of household debt to a level of 100% of GDP, which had never happened before except in the early years of the Great Depression, when the collapse of the economy, the collapse of GDP, caused debt to be much larger relative to GDP. Not sustainable. Can't keep doing this. The arrangement we had between the United States and China, the implicit arrangement, went along with that upward sloping line there. And we can't do that anymore. No more of that kind of borrowing. In the United States, consumers have begun to save again. The savings rate has risen from 0 to 4. My guess is it will keep rising until around 8, which was the historical norm. Much less demand in the United States. All of this in the context of a world economy that is probably going to be experiencing a Japanese-style lost decade, a persistent shortage of demand, persistently depressed economy, interest rates near 0. In a world like this, standard economics doesn't quite work. We always say that free international trade is good for everyone. We always say that a country that runs a trade surplus is actually helping other countries because it's supplying them with cheap goods. But in a world that is persistently underemployed, unfortunately, this is not true. Countries that are running trade surpluses are creating a problem for the deficit countries. This is a world in which surpluses are a beggar-thy-neighbor policy, a policy that does reduce demand and employment in other countries. This is a world in which mercantilism, which is ordinarily a great fallacy, is not so much of a fallacy. And so it's a world in which this kind of surplus becomes a real irritant. I don't know how this is going to play out, but I do know that if there is not a resolution, there's going to be extreme tension over China's surpluses. The period of sustained surpluses is no longer going to have the kind of tolerance from the rest of the world. Now, how is that going to work? Mechanically, there's an annual review of currency policy in the United States. The Treasury Department is required to certify that countries are not manipulating their currencies. And each year it certifies that China is not, but everyone knows that's not an honest assessment. It has instead been a decision not to provoke a crisis. That's going to become, if my fears are correct, and there's going to be a long-run, sustained period of inadequate demand, that's not going to be sustainable. That doesn't mean that China has to suffer terrible consequences. It means that China has to reorient its economy towards domestic demand. The era of export-led growth, the era of growth fed by gigantic trade surpluses, cannot last in the world we are now entering. So that's my first China problem. My second China problem is a bit milder, but still serious. In a way, I mentioned the second problem to remind myself that time tends to make any work look out of date. So I got this nice prize from Sweden, which was largely for what we called the new trade theory. These days, I actually hear my students calling it the old